Caleb Stratham had always prided himself on creating beauty where chaos once stood. It was, after all, the essence of his work as an architect. Yet, as he closed the door to his home that evening, the chaos that lingered in the silent, dimly lit rooms seemed insurmountable. His home in Charleston, with its high ceilings and ocean breeze, was a sanctuary he had carefully designed, each brick, each beam placed with purpose. Yet Adelaide, his wife, had become a stranger within its walls. "Dad!" Nathaniel's voice broke through the silence, rushing in from the kitchen. The boy's face, full of energy and hope, was a welcome respite from Caleb's encroaching dread. At just 14, Nathaniel had a knack for noticing when something was amiss. Caleb ruffled his son's dark curls, forcing a smile. "How was school today, Nate?" His voice came out steadier than he'd expected. "Good. I aced the math test. Oh, and guess what? Mom said I could go fishing with Uncle Lucian this weekend." The mention of Lucian Carter, Caleb's childhood friend, sent a strange tension through him. Lucian had been a constant presence in their lives, but lately his visits felt more intrusive. Caleb shook the thought away, determined not to let his suspicions poison his son's happiness. "That's great, buddy," he replied, masking his unease. Adelaide entered the room, her polished exterior betraying nothing. She was as stunning as the day they'd met, her auburn hair swept into a sleek ponytail, her green eyes sharp and unreadable. She greeted Caleb with a cursory glance, her attention fixed on her phone. "Dinner's in the oven," she said, her tone clipped. Caleb nodded, the words he wanted to say, needed to say, lodged in his throat. Their conversations had become increasingly transactional, her warmth replaced by a cool distance. It wasn't just the late nights or the phone she guarded so carefully. It was the absence of her presence, even when she was in the room. As they sat down for dinner, Caleb watched Adelaide closely, noting the way her fingers grazed the edge of her phone whenever it vibrated. Nathaniel chatted animatedly about his plans for the weekend, oblivious to the growing chasm between his parents. Later that night, as Caleb stood in their bedroom, he caught sight of Adelaide's reflection in the mirror. She was scrolling through her phone, her lips curled into a faint smile, a private smile, one he hadn't seen directed at him in years. His chest tightened. "Adelaide, is everything okay?" he ventured, his voice heavy with unspoken fears. She looked up, startled, her expression quickly shifting to one of practiced indifference. "Of course, why wouldn't it be?" But Caleb saw it, the fleeting flicker of guilt in her eyes. He nodded, stepping back, unwilling to confront the truth he wasn't ready to face. Yet, the seed of doubt had been planted, and he knew it would only grow. As he lay awake that night, listening to the sound of Adelaide's steady breathing, Caleb felt the weight of his suspicions pressing down on him. The life he had built, the family he adored, it all felt precariously fragile. Something was wrong, and deep down, he feared that this was only the beginning. The morning sunlight filtered through the sheer curtains, casting faint patterns across the bedroom floor. Caleb awoke to an empty bed. Adelaide was already gone, her side of the bed neatly made, as if she'd never been there at all. The smell of her lavender perfume lingered faintly, but it was the silence that weighed on him. No note, no goodbye, just absence. In the kitchen, Nathaniel was finishing a bowl of cereal, his face lit by the glow of his tablet. "Mom said she had errands," he said without looking up. His voice was casual, unaffected. "Did she say where?" Caleb asked, masking the unease rising in his chest. Nathaniel shrugged. "Nope, just that she'd be back before dinner." Caleb forced a smile. "All right, bud. Don't spend all day on that thing. Let's shoot some hoops later." "Sure, Dad," Nathaniel replied, his attention already back to his screen. Adelaide had always been meticulous about her routines. Grocery lists taped to the fridge, appointments penciled neatly into the family calendar. But lately, her life seemed to be spilling outside the lines, her comings and goings cloaked in ambiguity. Caleb tried to ignore it, but the inconsistencies gnawed at him like termites burrowing into a foundation. That afternoon, as Caleb worked on blueprints in his home office, his phone buzzed, a text from Adelaide. "Staying late with a friend. Don't wait up." Friend? The word hung in the air like a storm cloud. He stared at the message, his mind racing through possibilities. It wasn't like her to be vague, let alone dismissive. Something felt off. Hours passed, and Adelaide didn't come home until well after midnight. Caleb had waited in the living room, pretending to review plans, though his eyes never left the clock. When she finally walked through the door, her hair slightly disheveled, she froze at the sight of him. "Late meeting?" Caleb asked, his tone carefully neutral. Adelaide's lips curved into a faint smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Yes, I told you I'd be out." "With a friend?" he pressed, keeping his voice steady. She nodded, placing her bag on the counter. "Yes, Caleb, a friend. Can we not do this tonight? I'm exhausted." She didn't wait for a reply, heading upstairs without another word. Caleb sat there, the weight of her indifference sinking into him. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to trust her, but trust isn't built on vagueness and half-truths. It's built on presence, on connection, and both were slipping away. Over the next few weeks, Adelaide's behavior grew increasingly erratic. Caleb found himself cataloging her absences, the unexplained phone calls, the late nights, the fleeting smiles she reserved for someone he couldn't see. Her phone, once left casually on the counter, was now glued to her hand or tucked into her purse. One Saturday morning, while searching for Nathaniel's soccer cleats in the mudroom, Caleb stumbled upon something that sent a chill through him. A second cell phone, hidden beneath a pile of scarves. It was sleek, modern, and completely unfamiliar. He held it in his hand, his breath catching in his throat. Why would Adelaide need another phone? He pressed the power button, but the screen remained dark. A passcode, of course. He slipped it back where he'd found it, his heart pounding in his chest. The discovery confirmed what he had been dreading. Something was happening, and it wasn't innocent. Caleb spent the rest of the day in a fog, going through the motions but unable to shake the growing sense of betrayal. That night, as Adelaide lay beside him, her breathing soft and even, he stared at the ceiling, the weight of his suspicions pressing down like a lead blanket. "Who are you, Adelaide?" he whispered into the dark. The only answer was the sound of the waves crashing against the shore, steady and unyielding. Caleb stood in his home office, staring at the sleek second cell phone he'd retrieved from its hiding place. It felt heavier than it should, like it carried the weight of every unspoken truth Adelaide had hidden from him. His fingers hovered over the screen, itching to press the power button again, but he knew it was pointless without the passcode. The barrier between him and the answers he needed was maddening. A soft knock on the door startled him. He quickly shoved the phone into his desk drawer just as Nathaniel poked his head inside. "Dad, are we still going to the park?" Caleb forced a smile. "Of course, Nate, give me 5 minutes." As Nathaniel bounded away, Caleb leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. The world outside their home still turned, oblivious to the storm brewing within its walls. Adelaide's betrayal, though still unproven, was consuming him. He needed evidence, something concrete to shatter the illusion and protect what little stability remained for Nathaniel's sake. That evening, after Nathaniel had gone to bed, Caleb opened his laptop. His hands trembled as he typed into the search bar. Hidden cameras for home surveillance. The results flooded the screen, discrete devices designed to blend into any environment. The decision felt invasive, wrong even, but he justified it to himself. This wasn't about spying, it was about uncovering the truth. Within days, the cameras arrived. Caleb installed them carefully, strategically positioning them in the kitchen, living room, and their bedroom. Every screw tightened felt like a betrayal of his own, yet he couldn't shake the image of Adelaide's secretive smiles, her late-night absences, and that damned second phone. He had to know. The first few days yielded nothing but mundane domestic moments. Adelaide moved through the house with her usual grace, tending to Nathaniel and making small talk with Caleb. But her phone remained glued to her hand, her laughter quiet and private. It wasn't until the fourth night that something unusual happened. Caleb had gone to bed early, feigning exhaustion, while Adelaide stayed downstairs. He lay awake, watching the live feed from the camera in the living room on his laptop. His breath hitched when Adelaide's phone lit up with a notification. She hesitated, then grabbed the phone and headed for the patio. The camera outside was too far to pick up audio, but it caught the unmistakable body language of someone deeply engrossed in a private conversation. She leaned against the railing, her expression softening into a smile. Intimate, familiar. Caleb's chest tightened. He didn't need to hear the words to know this wasn't a casual call. The way she brushed her hair behind her ear, the way her lips curved as she laughed. It was a side of her he hadn't seen in years, a side she no longer showed him. The next morning, Caleb found himself staring at Adelaide across the breakfast table, his coffee growing cold in his hands. She seemed oblivious, cheerfully asking Nathaniel about his plans for the weekend. Caleb's mind raced, 1,000 questions swirling, but he held his tongue. Confronting her now would only drive her secrets deeper underground. He needed patience, a trait he never thought would feel so agonizing. That afternoon, Caleb made another call. This one wasn't to a tech store, but to a private investigator. The man's voice on the other end was calm, professional, as Caleb explained his situation. "I'll need access to her routines, any unusual behaviors," the investigator said, "and if you have any physical evidence, bring it to me." "I do," Caleb replied, his voice cracking slightly. "There's a second phone." "Good," the man said, his tone laced with quiet confidence. "We'll start there." As Caleb ended the call, a heavy weight settled over him. He was no longer just a husband searching for answers. He was a man preparing for the possibility of his entire life unraveling. Caleb sat in his truck, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The private investigator's envelope lay on the passenger seat, heavy with the truth he wasn't sure he was ready to confront. The edges of the manila paper were worn from his restless fingers, tracing it over and over during the drive home. Every fiber of him wanted to believe there was some mistake, some misunderstanding that could explain everything. But deep down, he knew better. He finally forced himself to open it, each photograph slipping out like a dagger aimed at his chest. The first image showed Adelaide sitting in a dimly lit cafe. Across from her sat Lucian Carter. They were laughing, leaning in close, their body language speaking volumes. The next few pictures only confirmed what he feared. Hand-holding under the table, an embrace as they left the cafe, and then the final blow. Lucian's car parked in the driveway of a small motel. Caleb felt the air leave his lungs. The images blurred as tears welled up in his eyes. His worst fears had materialized, not just as suspicions, but as irrefutable proof. He tossed the envelope onto the dashboard and buried his face in his hands. His chest heaved as a sob escaped, raw and guttural. The betrayal cut deeper than he thought possible. Later that evening, he sat in his office, staring blankly at the screen of his laptop. The camera footage from the previous nights played on a loop. There was Adelaide again, pacing on the patio, her voice low, but her tone unmistakably intimate. Though the audio was faint, certain words sliced through the static. "I can't wait to see you again," she'd said, her voice carrying a softness Caleb hadn't heard directed at him in years. He rewound the footage over and over, his mind racing with questions. How long had this been going on? Was Nathaniel oblivious, or did he sense it too? The thought of his son's world crumbling under the weight of these revelations was unbearable. Caleb felt anger rise within him, not just at Adelaide, but at himself. How had he missed the signs? How had he let this happen? The next morning, Caleb made a decision. He couldn't live in limbo any longer, torturing himself with unanswered questions. He needed clarity, no matter how much it hurt. He called Adelaide into the living room, his tone calm but firm. She appeared hesitant, her eyes darting to his as if searching for clues about what he might say. Caleb gestured to the couch and she sat down, her posture guarded. "I need you to be honest with me," Caleb began, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. "Is there something going on between you and Lucian?" Adelaide flinched at the mention of Lucian's name. She opened her mouth as if to respond, but hesitated. The silence that followed was deafening. "I saw the pictures," Caleb continued, his voice cracking slightly. "I know about the motel." Her face paled, and for a moment he thought she might deny it. Instead, she let out a shaky breath and buried her face in her hands. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she whispered, her words muffled but unmistakable. "It just happened." Caleb's heart shattered all over again. The woman he had loved, the mother of his son, had not only betrayed him, but now sat before him offering excuses that felt like hollow echoes of what they once had. "What about Nathaniel?" Caleb asked, his voice rising with desperation. "Does he know? Does he suspect?" Adelaide shook her head vehemently. "No, Caleb, he doesn't know. I swear." But Caleb could no longer trust her words, her promises. Every syllable felt like another crack in the fragile foundation of their lives. He stood, his hands trembling. "I need time to think," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need space." Adelaide reached out to him, her fingers brushing against his arm, but he pulled away. "Caleb, please," she pleaded. But he was already walking away, his mind spinning with the weight of the truth. The weight of the truth pressed heavily on Caleb's chest as he sat at the edge of the bed. The room was dimly lit, the faint glow of the streetlights outside filtering through the curtains. Adelaide's side of the bed was as pristine as ever, a stark contrast to the chaos swirling inside him. Tonight, he wouldn't let her retreat into silence. Tonight, the truth would be confronted. Adelaide entered the room, her heels clicking softly on the hardwood floor. She froze for a moment when she saw him sitting there, his posture tense, his gaze locked on her. "Can we talk?" Caleb's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that made her hesitate. "Of course," she replied, setting her purse down on the dresser. Her movements were deliberate, almost rehearsed, as if bracing herself for whatever was coming. Caleb stood and took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly. "I need you to tell me the truth, Adelaide. No lies, no excuses. Just the truth." Her face hardened, her carefully composed mask slipping for a brief moment. "What are you talking about?" she asked, feigning confusion. "You know exactly what I'm talking about," Caleb said, his voice firm now. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the envelope, tossing it onto the bed between them. "This. Lucian, the motel, the lies." Adelaide's eyes widened, and for a fleeting second panic flickered across her face, but she quickly recovered, crossing her arms defensively. "You had me followed?" she asked, her tone accusatory. "I had to," Caleb shot back, "because every word out of your mouth has been a lie. Do you have any idea what it feels like to look at these pictures? To know that my wife, the mother of my son, has been sneaking around with someone I considered a friend?" Adelaide's defenses crumbled under the weight of his words. She sat down heavily on the edge of the bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then what? It just happened?" Caleb's voice rose, his frustration boiling over. "Don't insult me, Adelaide. You don't just accidentally destroy a family." Tears welled up in her eyes, but Caleb felt no sympathy. He had given her everything, his love, his trust, and she had torn it apart. "How long?" he demanded, his voice trembling. "How long has this been going on?" Adelaide hesitated, her hands twisting in her lap. "A year," she admitted finally, "but it didn't mean—" "Don't you dare say it didn't mean anything," Caleb interrupted, his voice breaking. "You don't destroy a marriage, a life we built together, for something that doesn't mean anything." Adelaide flinched at his words, tears streaming down her face now. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I never wanted to hurt you." Caleb laughed bitterly, the sound hollow and sharp. "Hurt me? Adelaide, you didn't just hurt me. You betrayed me. You betrayed Nathaniel. Do you even think about what this will do to him?" "I love Nathaniel," she said quickly, her voice desperate. This has nothing to do with him." "It has everything to do with him!" Caleb shouted, his anger finally spilling over. "He deserves better than a mother who lies and cheats." For a long moment, the only sound in the room was Adelaide's quiet sobbing. Caleb turned away, running a hand through his hair. His chest felt tight, his heart pounding with the weight of everything that had just been said. "I need you to leave," he said finally, his voice hollow. "I don't know where you'll go, and frankly I don't care, but you can't stay here." Adelaide looked up at him, her face pale and streaked with tears. "Caleb, please." "Don't," he said, his tone final. "Pack your things and go. I'll explain to Nathaniel in the morning." Adelaide opened her mouth to protest, but the look in Caleb's eyes silenced her. She nodded slowly and rose from the bed, her steps hesitant as she began gathering her things. Caleb watched her go, his heart heavy but resolute. This wasn't the ending he had envisioned, but it was the only way forward. Caleb sat at the kitchen table, his coffee untouched. The room was still, save for the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. He had been rehearsing the conversation in his mind all night, but nothing could prepare him for what he was about to do. How do you break the illusion of stability for a child? How do you tell them that the world they've known is built on lies? "Dad?" Nathaniel's voice startled him, and he turned to see his son standing in the doorway, his hair tousled from sleep. "What's wrong?" Caleb motioned for him to sit. Nathaniel hesitated, sensing the weight of the moment, before pulling out a chair across from his father. "We need to talk," Caleb began, his voice steady but soft. "About your mom." Nathaniel's eyes widened slightly, but he didn't speak. He simply nodded, bracing himself. Caleb took a deep breath. "Your mom and things haven't been good for a while, and I've recently found out that she's been seeing someone else." Nathaniel's face fell, his expression a mix of shock and confusion. "What do you mean, like a friend?" Caleb shook his head. "No, Nathaniel, not like a friend. She's been in a relationship with someone else, Lucian." The name landed like a blow. Nathaniel's hands clenched into fists on the table, his face flushing with anger. "Uncle Lucian," he said, his voice rising. "Are you serious? How long has this been going on?" "A year," Caleb replied, his heart breaking at the sight of his son's pain. "I didn't want to believe it, but I have proof. I'm sorry, Nate. I know this is a lot to take in." Nathaniel pushed back his chair abruptly, standing up and pacing the room. "I can't believe this," he muttered, his voice cracking. "She's been lying to us this whole time?" Caleb stood and placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "Listen to me," he said gently. "None of this is your fault, and it doesn't change how much I love you or how much I'll always be here for you." Nathaniel stopped pacing and looked up at his father, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Did she ever love us, or was it all just a lie?" The question pierced through Caleb like a knife. "Of course she loved you," he said, his voice trembling. "And she still does in her own way. But she made some terrible choices, and now we have to figure out how to move forward." Nathaniel sat back down, his shoulders slumped. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the clock ticking, marking the heavy passage of time. "Dad," Nathaniel said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "there's something I need to tell you too." Caleb's heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" Nathaniel hesitated, his hands fidgeting nervously. "Uncle Lucian, he's been weird with me sometimes, like he's always making these comments about how I look like him. At first I thought he was just joking, but now I'm not so sure." The words hit Caleb like a sledgehammer. He struggled to keep his composure, his mind racing with the implications. "Nathaniel," he said, kneeling beside his son, "I need you to tell me everything. Don't leave anything out." Nathaniel nodded, his voice shaky as he recounted the times Lucian had made him uncomfortable. Each word fueled Caleb's growing anger and determination. Whatever happened next, he knew one thing for certain. He would protect his son at all costs. "I promise you," Caleb said, his voice steady and firm. "We'll get through this together, and I won't let anyone hurt you again." Nathaniel's arms wrapped around his father in a fierce hug, and for the first time in days, Caleb felt a glimmer of hope. The truth had shattered their world, but it had also brought them closer. Now, they would face whatever came next as a team. Caleb stared at the neatly stacked files on his desk, each containing a fragment of the shattered reality he now faced. The photographs, the surveillance footage, the receipts. It was all there, irrefutable proof of Adelaide and Lucian's betrayal. But this wasn't just about betrayal anymore. This was about Nathaniel, about ensuring his son was safe and protected from the shadow of deception that had poisoned their lives. He reached for his phone and dialed the private investigator's number. It rang twice before the steady, no-nonsense voice of Sterling Whitcomb answered. "Mr. Stratham," Sterling said, his tone professional. "What can I do for you?" "I'm ready to take the next step," Caleb replied, his voice firm despite the storm raging inside him. "I want everything we've gathered to be sent to my attorney. I'm not letting them get away with this." "Understood," Sterling said. "I'll have it delivered by the end of the day. Are you prepared for what this might mean? Things could escalate." "I don't care," Caleb said, his jaw tightening. "I've been living in their lies for too long. It stops now. Later that afternoon, Caleb met with his attorney, Sterling Whitcomb's recommended contact, Franklin Aldridge. Franklin was a seasoned litigator, known for his sharp mind and unyielding approach in the courtroom. As Caleb laid out the evidence, Franklin nodded grimly, jotting notes on a yellow legal pad. "This is strong," Franklin said, sliding the photos back into their folder. "But if we're going to make this stick, we need to hit them on every front: infidelity, emotional harm, and most importantly, endangering Nathaniel." Caleb frowned. "Endangering him how?" Franklin leaned forward, his expression serious. "You mentioned Nathaniel's concerns about Lucian. If we can show that Lucian's involvement posed a threat to your son, it strengthens your case for full custody. Have you considered a DNA test?" The suggestion hit Caleb like a punch to the gut. "You think Nathaniel might not be my son?" "I'm not saying that," Franklin said carefully. "But if there's even a possibility, it's better to have clarity now than for it to come up later in court. It could make all the difference." Caleb hesitated, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He had always seen Nathaniel as his son, no matter what biology might say. But the truth, no matter how painful, was better than living in doubt. "Do it," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need to know." The days that followed were a blur of legal preparations and quiet moments with Nathaniel. Caleb tried to shield his son from the storm brewing around them, but the tension in the house was palpable. Adelaide had left, taking refuge with Lucian, and the silence she left behind was both a relief and a constant reminder of their fractured family. One evening, as Caleb and Nathaniel sat on the porch watching the sunset, the boy turned to him with a question that cut straight to his heart. "Dad, are we going to be okay?" Nathaniel asked, his voice small but steady. Caleb placed a hand on his son's shoulder, pulling him close. "Yes, Nate," he said firmly. "We're going to be more than okay. We're going to be stronger, I promise." The following week, the DNA results arrived. Caleb opened the envelope with trembling hands, his heart pounding in his chest. The words on the page blurred as his eyes scanned the document. Then he saw it. Proof that Nathaniel was, without question, his biological son. A sob of relief escaped Caleb's lips, and he clutched the paper to his chest. This was the clarity he needed, the anchor that steadied him in the chaos. Nathaniel was his in every sense of the word, and now he would fight with everything he had to protect him. Caleb called Franklin immediately, his resolve stronger than ever. "Let's go after them," he said, his voice filled with determination. "I don't just want custody. I want to make sure they never hurt us again." Franklin's response was simple and resolute. "Then let's get to work." The tension in the air was thick enough to choke on as Caleb parked his truck outside the modest cafe where Adelaide had requested to meet. It was a public place, neutral ground, she had called it, but there was nothing neutral about the storm raging inside him. He had come prepared, the evidence meticulously compiled in the folder sitting on the passenger seat. He wasn't here for reconciliation. He was here for closure. As he entered the cafe, his eyes immediately found her. Adelaide was seated at a corner table, her hair tied back in a casual bun, her expression a mix of apprehension and defiance. Lucian was nowhere to be seen, but Caleb could feel his shadow lingering in the space between them. "Caleb," Adelaide greeted, her voice cautious as he approached. She gestured to the seat across from her, and he sat, his movements deliberate, measured. "You wanted to talk," Caleb said, his tone steady but cold. "So talk." Adelaide hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her napkin. I wanted to apologize," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "For everything." Caleb leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Everything? That's a lot to apologize for. Be specific." Her eyes darted away, guilt flashing across her face. "For the affair, for lying to you, for hurting you and Nathaniel." The mention of their son's name ignited a spark of anger in Caleb's chest. "Hurting me is one thing," he said, his voice low but sharp. "But Nathaniel, you let Lucian around him. Let him make him feel like—" He broke off, his voice trembling with rage. "Do you even realize the damage you've done?" "I didn't know," Adelaide said quickly, her eyes pleading. I didn't know Lucian was saying those things to him, I swear. You didn't know because you didn't care to know, Caleb shot back. You were too busy sneaking around to see what was happening right in front of you. Adelaide flinched at his words, tears welling in her eyes. I made mistakes, Caleb, she said, her voice cracking. But I love Nathaniel. I would never intentionally hurt him. Caleb shook his head, his jaw tightening. Love? Don't talk to me about love. Love is showing up. Love is being there. Love is protecting the people you care about, not putting them in harm's way. Adelaide's tears spilled over, but Caleb felt no sympathy. She had built this house of lies, and now it was collapsing around her. I'm filing for custody, he said, his voice resolute. Full custody. You can have supervised visitation, but that's it. Her eyes widened in shock. You can't do that, she said, her voice rising. You can't just take him away from me. Watch me, Caleb replied, his tone icy. He leaned forward, his gaze piercing. You made your choices, Adelaide. Now you have to live with the consequences. She opened her mouth to respond, but he cut her off. And if you think for 1 second I'll let Lucian anywhere near my son again, you're even more delusional than I thought. Adelaide stared at him, her face pale, her hands trembling. For the first time, Caleb saw fear in her eyes. Not fear of him, but fear of losing the one thing she had left. I'll fight you, she said finally, her voice shaking. I'll fight you for Nathaniel. Caleb stood, his movements deliberate. You can try, he said, picking up the folder from the table. But the truth is on my side, and this time, Adelaide, you don't get to win. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the cafe, his heart pounding but his resolve stronger than ever. This wasn't over, far from it. But Caleb was ready for the fight, for Nathaniel, for himself, and for the life they deserved. The courtroom buzzed with quiet anticipation as Caleb sat at the plaintiff's table, his heart pounding. To his left, Franklin Aldridge was meticulously organizing the files and evidence they had amassed. Across the room sat Adelaide and Lucian, their expressions carefully neutral. But Caleb could see through the facade, the nervous flicker of Adelaide's gaze, the way Lucian's fingers tapped impatiently on the table. This was it. Months of preparation, of anguish, of fighting for Nathaniel's future, all led to this moment. All rise, the bailiff announced, and the courtroom stood as Judge Everett Hollingsworth entered. His presence commanded respect, his sharp eyes sweeping the room as he took his seat. The opening arguments were swift, but the tension grew heavier with every passing minute. Franklin began by laying out the timeline of events, methodically detailing the affair and its impact on Nathaniel's well-being. As Franklin spoke, he projected images on the screen, photos of Adelaide and Lucian's rendezvous, receipts from the motel, and transcripts of text messages. Each piece of evidence landed like a blow, stripping away their defenses. Lucian leaned toward his attorney, whispering furiously. Adelaide sat stiffly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Caleb watched her, searching for a flicker of remorse, but found none. When it was Adelaide's turn to testify, she hesitated before taking the stand. Her voice was shaky as she tried to explain her actions, painting herself as a victim of circumstance. I never meant to hurt anyone, she said, her voice trembling. I made mistakes, but I love my son. Franklin rose from his seat, his demeanor calm but unyielding. Mrs. Stratham, he began, his voice cutting through the courtroom. You claim to love your son, yet you knowingly brought someone into his life who made him uncomfortable, someone who undermined his relationship with his father. How do you reconcile that? Adelaide's eyes darted to Lucian, then back to Franklin. I didn't know, she stammered. I thought Lucian cared about Nathaniel. You thought wrong, Franklin said sharply. He turned to the judge. Your Honor, the plaintiff's case includes testimony from Nathaniel himself, detailing the inappropriate comments and behavior Mr. Carter exhibited. Caleb's jaw tightened as the court clerk played the audio recording of Nathaniel's statement. His son's voice, steady yet vulnerable, echoed through the room. He always said I looked like him, Nathaniel had said. It made me feel weird, like I didn't belong to my dad. The room fell silent as the weight of the statement sank in. Adelaide covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking. Lucian's smug expression faltered, his confidence crumbling under the scrutiny. Franklin's next move was the final blow. He presented the results of the DNA test, confirming that Nathaniel was, beyond doubt, Caleb's biological son. The revelation struck like lightning, dispelling any lingering doubts and solidifying Caleb's case. When Lucian was called to testify, his arrogance was palpable. He tried to downplay his role, blaming Adelaide and dismissing Nathaniel's feelings as misunderstandings. But Franklin dismantled his defense piece by piece, exposing his manipulations and lies. The judge's ruling came swiftly. Full custody was granted to Caleb, with Adelaide receiving only supervised visitation. Lucian's behavior toward Nathaniel, coupled with his interference in the family, earned him a restraining order. As the court adjourned, Caleb exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He turned to Franklin, gratitude shining in his eyes. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Outside the courtroom, Nathaniel ran to him, wrapping his arms tightly around his father. "We did it, Dad," he whispered. Caleb held his son close, the weight of the battle finally lifting. "Yeah, buddy," he said, his voice steady with newfound strength. "We did." The house was quiet in a way Caleb hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't the oppressive silence of distrust or tension. It was peaceful, a stillness that invited reflection rather than fear. Nathaniel was upstairs, likely sketching superheroes or tinkering with the model airplane they'd started building together. For once, the air felt lighter. Caleb sat on the couch, a steaming cup of coffee in hand, staring at the framed photo of Nathaniel on the mantel. His boy, his son, not just in blood but in every memory and sacrifice. The DNA results had brought clarity, but the real proof was in the bond they had built over the years, a bond no betrayal could sever. The sound of footsteps drew Caleb's attention, and he looked up to see Nathaniel standing at the base of the stairs. He was holding the model airplane, his brow furrowed in concentration as he inspected its wings. "Dad, I think we need more glue," Nathaniel said, his tone serious. Caleb smiled. "You're probably right. Let's check the garage later." Nathaniel nodded but didn't move. He lingered, his gaze flickering between the airplane and his father. "You okay, Dad?" he asked softly. The question caught Caleb off guard. He set his coffee down and patted the seat beside him. Nathaniel walked over, sitting close, his small hands gripping the airplane tightly. "I'm getting there," Caleb admitted. "It's been a tough few months, but having you here makes it better." Nathaniel looked up, his expression thoughtful. "Do you miss her?" Caleb hesitated. The truth was complicated, layered with emotions he wasn't sure how to articulate. "I miss the idea of her," he said finally, "the person I thought she was. But people change, and sometimes they make choices that hurt us." Nathaniel nodded slowly as if trying to process the weight of those words. "I miss her too," he admitted. "But I like how it feels now, like we're a team." Caleb's chest tightened, and he pulled Nathaniel into a hug. "We are a team," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "and we always will be." Later that week, Caleb decided to reconnect with an old friend. Serafina Hale had been a constant support since they'd reconnected months ago, her quiet strength and understanding a balm to his wounded spirit. She had seen him at his worst, and yet she stayed, offering words of encouragement and moments of levity when he needed them most. They met for coffee at a small cafe downtown. Serafina was already waiting when he arrived, her warm smile easing the tension in his chest. "Caleb," she greeted, her tone gentle but bright. "How's Nathaniel?" "He's good," Caleb replied, sitting across from her. "Better than I expected, honestly. He's stronger than I give him credit for." "And how about you?" she asked, her gaze piercing but kind. Caleb hesitated, then sighed. "I'm trying. Some days are easier than others, but I feel lighter, like I can finally breathe again." Serafina reached across the table, her hand resting lightly on his. "That's progress," she said softly. "And you deserve that." They talked for hours, their conversation flowing effortlessly. Caleb found himself smiling more than he had in weeks, the weight of his struggles momentarily forgotten. As they said their goodbyes, Serafina squeezed his hand. "Call me if you ever need to talk," she said. "Or even if you don't, I'm here." Caleb watched her walk away, a strange sense of hope blooming in his chest. It was too soon to think about what might come next, but for the first time in a long time, the future didn't feel so daunting. Back at home, Caleb found Nathaniel asleep on the couch, the model airplane resting on his chest. Caleb covered him with a blanket, his heart swelling with love and gratitude. They had been through the storm, and while the road ahead wasn't without challenges, they were moving forward, together. The late afternoon sun bathed the backyard in a warm golden glow as laughter filled the air. Caleb stood by the grill, flipping burgers, while Nathaniel darted around the yard with his friends, a soccer ball rolling ahead of him. For the first time in years, the house felt alive again, not with the forced politeness of a fractured family, but with genuine warmth and joy. Caleb glanced toward the patio where Serafina was helping set the table. She had integrated seamlessly into their lives, her presence a steady, calming force. Over the past few months, their connection had deepened, built on trust, understanding, and a shared determination to heal. Caleb hadn't planned for it, hadn't expected it, but Serafina had become an anchor, not just for him, but for Nathaniel as well. "Need any help over there, Chef?" Serafina called, a playful smile lighting up her face. "I've got it under control," Caleb replied, grinning. "Unless you don't trust my grilling skills." "I trust you," she said, her words carrying a weight beyond their casual context. Their eyes met, and for a moment the world seemed to still. After dinner, the kids retreated to the living room, their laughter echoing through the house. Caleb and Serafina remained outside, the quiet hum of crickets filling the space between them. Caleb leaned back in his chair, gazing at the stars. "I didn't think I'd ever feel like this again," he admitted softly. "Like what?" Serafina asked, her voice gentle. "Like things could be good again," he said. "For a long time I thought the best days were behind me, that the damage was too much to fix. But now, I don't know. I feel hopeful." Serafina reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. "You've been through hell, Caleb. But you've come out stronger, and Nathaniel, he's incredible. That's because of you." Caleb squeezed her hand, his throat tightening with emotion. "It's not just me," he said. "You've been there for us in ways I can't even put into words. I don't think we'd be here without you." She smiled, her eyes glistening. "I love you, Caleb, and I love Nathaniel. You're my family now." The words hung in the air, their weight sinking into Caleb's heart. He stood, pulling Serafina to her feet. "I love you too," he said, his voice steady and sure, "and I want you to be part of this family, for real." Reaching into his pocket, Caleb pulled out a small velvet box. Serafina gasped softly as he opened it, revealing a simple yet elegant ring. "I know it's soon," Caleb said, his voice trembling slightly, "but life doesn't wait, and I don't want to spend another day without you by my side. Will you marry me?" Tears spilled down Serafina's cheeks as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "1,000 times, yes." Nathaniel appeared at the door, his face lighting up as he took in the scene. "Are you guys?" he began, his voice trailing off in disbelief. Caleb turned to his son, a broad smile on his face. "She said yes," he said simply. Nathaniel rushed forward, throwing his arms around both of them. "Does this mean I get to call her Mom now?" he asked, his voice muffled against Caleb's chest. Serafina laughed through her tears. "Only if you want to," she said, her voice warm and full of love. "I do," Nathaniel said firmly. "You're the best." As the three of them embraced under the fading light, Caleb felt a sense of completeness he hadn't thought possible. They weren't perfect, and their path had been anything but easy, but they were a family, a new family, built on resilience, love, and the promise of better days ahead. The morning sun streamed through the open windows, carrying the scent of wildflowers and a light breeze that danced across the room. Caleb stood in the kitchen, flipping pancakes while Nathaniel sat at the counter, scribbling in his notebook. A small radio played softly in the background, a mix of country and pop filling the space with a sense of calm. "Chocolate chips or blueberries?" Caleb asked, glancing over his shoulder at his son. Nathaniel didn't look up but grinned. "Both." "Both it is," Caleb replied, laughing as he added the ingredients to the batter. He had gotten better at mornings like this, quiet, steady, and filled with small rituals that made life feel normal again. Serafina walked in, her hair still damp from the shower and her smile as radiant as the sunlight pouring through the window. She kissed Nathaniel on the top of his head before wrapping her arms around Caleb from behind. "Smells amazing," she murmured. "Only the best for my family," Caleb said, turning his head to kiss her cheek. The word family came easily now, no longer tinged with uncertainty. They were a team, stronger together, and every day felt like a step closer to something whole. After breakfast, they loaded up the car for their weekend outing, a small picnic by the lake, one of Nathaniel's favorite places. The lake had become a sanctuary for all of them, a place to reflect and dream. Caleb had chosen it intentionally, a symbol of how far they had come and how much lay ahead. As they spread out the blanket under a shady oak, Nathaniel darted toward the water with a frisbee, Serafina chasing after him. Caleb watched them, his heart full. They looked so natural together, like a scene out of a life he'd never dared to imagine for himself. "Your throw needs work," Serafina teased as she caught the frisbee midair. "Blame the wind," Nathaniel shouted back, laughing. Caleb joined them, the three of them forming a small circle, tossing the frisbee and joking until they were breathless with laughter. The simplicity of it all was what struck him most. How joy could exist even after so much pain. How they could rebuild something beautiful from the ashes of betrayal. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, they sat together on the blanket, sharing sandwiches and stories. Nathaniel leaned against Caleb's shoulder, his voice growing soft as he spoke. "Dad, I'm glad it's like this now," he said. "I feel happy." Caleb's throat tightened. He wrapped an arm around his son, pulling him close. "Me too, buddy," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "Me too." Serafina rested her head on Caleb's other shoulder, her hand finding his. "This is what it's all about," she said softly. "Moments like this." Caleb nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude. For the first time in years, the future didn't feel like something to fear. It felt like a blank canvas, waiting for them to fill it with love, laughter, and new memories. That night, as they returned home and Nathaniel drifted off to sleep, Caleb and Serafina stood on the porch, the cool night air wrapping around them. Caleb turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking," he said. "About what's next, about us." Serafina smiled, her eyes warm. "What about us?" "I don't want to rush things," Caleb said, his voice steady. "But I know what I want. I want this, our life together. I want to build something with you." Serafina leaned in, her forehead resting against his. "You already are," she whispered. "We all are." As they stood there, wrapped in each other's embrace, the stars above seemed brighter, more vibrant. It wasn't the end of their story, but the beginning of something new, something better. Together they were finding their way, one step at a time, toward a future filled with hope. What do you think of Caleb and his journey to rebuild his family? From which region are you watching this video? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to follow all our stories. And don't forget to check out more heartwarming tales by clicking here on the end screen. Thank you for watching.